So my name is Danielle. I am a manager at Apollo, and I manage the team that builds our platform, our Apollo product. So if you've used Apollo Engine, if you've used our schema change validation workflow, if you've used our operation, safe listing tools, those are all tools that my team builds and manages. Today, we're going to be talking about the GraphQL developer experience. So one of our main goals at Apollo is to make sure that every one of you here in this room and everyone in the world in our community who isn't here in San Francisco today is productive and successful using GraphQL. It's something that we care a lot about as a DevTools company. It's something that I suspect you all care about because you came out today to talk about GraphQL with us. When people ask, what is GraphQL, how do you typically describe that? GraphQL is a way to communicate between a query and an API. So an API doesn't just have to be a GraphQL schema, a GraphQL endpoint. It can be anything that returns data in the shape that the query needs it to. It can even be a cache, for example, which you'll see later in the talk and the demo. Typically, when we describe GraphQL, we say, oh, well, you write a GraphQL query, you describe exactly the fields that you want, and your endpoint, your server, gives you back exactly the data that you requested. This talk today is not going to be a typical GraphQL talk, because what I want to show you is that the value of GraphQL is actually not only in all of these technical things that we usually talk about. GraphQL is not about smaller payloads. It's not about fewer client-to-server round trips. It's not about preventing overfetching. Yes, these are all fantastic technical benefits of GraphQL. But if you want to adopt GraphQL in your organization, it's going to take work. It's actually like an architectural change. It's something you really have to dedicate yourselves to. And when people usually make that case at their company, they make it based on the technical improvements. They say, oh, well, our app is going to have really increased performance, and we're going to have all these things. But I think, and we think at Apollo, that the value of GraphQL is not only in these technical benefits, it's actually in the productivity boost that you as developers will get by using GraphQL at your organization at all levels of the stack. The excellent developer experience is really where GraphQL shines. It's kind of the honest and the very undervalued value of GraphQL. So what's the most important thing to any company? What's the most important thing to your guys' companies? People. Yeah, what else? Low ramp of time. The customer. I mean, the most important thing to any company is the customer, you guys. Come on. And how much time do you actually spend building for your customer in your development at your company? It's probably not as much as you would hope, not as much as you would even guess. A lot of our time is spent doing tech debt reduction, it's spent doing refactoring, it's spent in meetings. And there's a lot of reasons for this, one of them being that there are aspects of development that are just plain difficult, and we all kind of acknowledge that and just cope with that. But if you have a better developer experience, you're actually going to end up shipping products faster. And not only are you going to ship products faster, but you're going to be able to recruit and retain better engineers. Your engineers will be more happy in their jobs. And through all of that, you're going to end up building a much better experience and a much better product for your customer. So what does a good developer experience look like? Great developer experience should spark joy. It should really make your job fun. You should enjoy getting to write the code that you're writing. And we care about and we think about developer experience all the time at Apollo. We talk about it all the time. So my coworker Peggy, who follows Peggy on Twitter? It's a lot of you guys. My coworker Peggy, she tweeted this out about a month ago. She said, "What does great developer experience look like to you?" And we got about 100 responses, so we kind of looked through them, and we categorized all of those responses from developers in the world into kind of 3 categories. So good developer experience, it's predictable and intuitive, it's unobtrusive, it gets out of your way, and it gives you an instant feedback loop. And so when we were thinking, what are some really good examples of tools that do this? Well, for predictable and intuitive, React came to mind. I mean, React is not that old. React is only about 5 years old. Remember the first time you built a React component? What did we have before React? We had Django, we had PHP, we had Angular. A lot of us were just using jQuery. So the first time I built a React component and I realized that my front-end components could be stateful, and every time I clicked a button, I didn't have to set the inner HTML of a div to an empty string, like in 15 lines. That was a really big moment. React has completely changed the landscape of front-end development for us. Or how about Prettier? Who uses Prettier? Yeah, it's most of you guys. Peggy's actually the one that got me hooked on Prettier. I didn't quite understand the value until she got me using it. And I can't even begin to state how much time using Prettier has saved me in my development. I mean, I just don't think about spacing anymore. I don't think about indentation. I don't think about linting or formatting. It's not even a concern that bothered me until I put together this slide. Or how about VS Code? VS Code has a fantastic integration with TypeScript. And so us as developers now, if you're using TypeScript in VS Code, as a JavaScript developer, we can finally get type safety in our IDE, which is something that other developers have been laughing at us about for like 10 years. And what's the reason that we love these tools on this slide so much? It's because they solve real problems for us. And what's one of the biggest problems that we still have today as front-end developers? We write a lot of data fetching code. Data fetching in React, it's not really something that React has taken a strong opinion on. And so there are a lot of different ways that people have done this in React, and there aren't a lot of recommendations. And as a result, people have kind of built a bunch of spaghetti. This is a tweet from Adam at Airbnb, who we actually work pretty closely with. He said, 2 million lines, of their 2 million lines of JavaScript, only 10 to 15% of that is actual business logic and complex interaction. The rest is just styles and data fetching. I mean, that's completely bonkers. That means that almost 90% of the development that they're doing at Airbnb is not like valuing us, the Airbnb customers, unless you guys really like their styles, which I do. So what's the answer to this mess around data and how we manage it? The answer is that you need a dedicated front-end data layer, and you need to treat it well. You need to think about it in that way. You need to be able to answer these questions of what is the data in my API? Without a dedicated front-end data layer, I mean, what are our options? I bet a lot of us have used GraphQL already. That's why you're here. So we know the really nice experience of graphical or GraphQL playgrounds. But whenever I need to figure out how to get data from a REST endpoint, I end up in my terminal trying to write a curl command, fiddling with my headers a lot. And when I finally get that right, I copy it back into my code. It takes many, many, many steps. And I have to do that for every single query. It's just so much time. Or how about if you want to track the loading states and the errors in your front end and you want to bring that back to the user? Or how about if you want to actually manage state on your client and be able to persist data when your page reloads and things like that? When people build an application that's big enough to actually need persistence, need caching, and care about these things, in React, our typical answer is like, oh, well, I need a cache now. I finally got to that point. I'll just throw everything into Redux. But Redux, at its core, it's an event emitter. And it's an elegant programming model, but it's actually a very small amount of code. And so to turn it into a cache, you end up layering a bunch of packages. You end up using a bunch of custom middleware. It takes a lot of code in the end. And so for a lot of reasons, I think that the next frontier of innovation for development on the front end, and especially in React, is going to be around building this data layer. React itself has really transformed the landscape of how we build front ends. In the short 5 years that it's been around as kind of core open source that we can all use, it's itself made dramatic improvements to its own programming model. And I don't know, who here has used React hooks? Tried out the new hooks API? Yeah, they recently released that. I mean, even React hooks is a massive improvement on the programming model of state management. So if we can optimize our data layer, can we improve our developer experience? This is kind of the question that I come back to. And this is what I want to show you guys today. So for the rest of the talk, We're going to be writing some code together. The premise of this demo is I went over to the Redux main website, and I looked through their examples, and there's actually an example in there that uses the GitHub API. So I thought, oh, it's perfect. Like, Redux example on the GitHub API, GitHub has a GraphQL API. So what we're going to do today is we're going to build the GraphQL version of this Redux example app called Real World. And I need to set up my computer for the demo, so give me 1 sec. All right, can you all, is this big enough? Can you see that in the back? Thumbs up. Sweet. OK. This is our Redux app. So it's pretty simple. We've got an input box. And if I type in my GitHub username here and click Go, it's going to load my profile. So it'll give me my GitHub avatar picture, my full name from the GitHub API, because all I gave it was my username. And then it gives me this nice list of my starred repositories. So what does it take to actually build this user page in Redux? You can see here that the props to this component, well, first off, we've got our login prop, which gives us our username. But then we also have the user object. And then we also have the function to load the user object, and the function to request the loading of the starred repositories, and then the starred repositories themselves, and some loading states. Have you guys seen components like this before? Written your own components like this before? Not only are there a lot of props being passed to this seemingly simple page, but at the bottom of this page, we have this really nice and very large map states to props function, which is just the way you do things in Redux. And in addition to that, to actually fetch all of that data, we had to create a bunch of actions. We had to create a bunch of reducers in Redux, and we even had to create a bunch of custom API middleware. So this is our actions file. It's nice and long. We've got all these actions triggered on, like, oh, I was successfully able to load the repositories. I failed to load the repositories. The list goes on and on. So for our demo, what does this look like if we want to build this using GraphQL and using Apollo? So I've started a page for us here, same component, user page component. We've got an input box over here. If I type my GitHub username, it's going to return Jon Snow, the true king, because it's not actually loading data from the GitHub API yet. So all I've got in this file, I've got my GraphQL query, which can be run against the GitHub endpoint to get back my name and my login. And then I've got my React component. So what we need to do is we need to connect these two things together. The first thing that stuck out to me, or that sticks out to me when I look at this, is that this is all green. It's all a string. That's not super useful, not super safe. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go over and install the Apollo extension. So now if I go back to my user page, we have syntax highlighting. It's super nice. And not only do we have syntax highlighting, but I set this up to be an Apollo project. So VS Code is actually aware of my schema. And as a result, if I highlight over any one of these things in my query, you're going to see type defs directly from my schema. So query, the type, has a user field, and it returns a user object. User, the type, has a login field, and it returns a non-nullable string. And user also has a name field, and it returns a nullable string. And not only that, but if I type command space, I'm going to get autocomplete for all of the rest of the fields on that object in my schema. So the only other field I need is avatar URL, which, thanks to the alphabet, is right there at the top. OK, so now I have all the fields that I need on my query to get the data to replace Jon Snow with my picture. What should I do next? I'm going to hook up my query to my component. And to do that, I'm going to show you guys something that I'm super excited about, which is the use query React hook that we just dropped last week at Apollo Day, New York. Oops. Apollo React hooks. What did I do wrong? Import, not const. There we go. All right, so now I've got my use query hook. And over here, if I call my useQuery hook with my user query query, and I give it the variable option of my login username, from that function, I will be able to get a data object and a loading flag. That's what it's going to return. So now, if I were to hit save, I still haven't hooked up data into my component yet, but data would actually be hydrating from that query directly from the GraphQL API. So if the page is loading, if the data is not there yet, let's return a loading indicator. But if it's not loading, if loading is true, then we should be able to get data.user.name, data.user.login, and data.user.avatar URL directly from our query. So if I hit save, oh no! Classic, what did I do wrong? Cannot read property user of undefined. Yes, thank you so much. Thank you to the person in the back. Demos are very intimidating. Someone knows how to use React to Apollo. OK, so I've got data, I've got user. Now you can see this is hooked up directly from the GitHub API. So that's good to go. So that's step one. I got all my query stuff hooked up. Step two is I actually want type safety. So I want to be able to make sure that the TypeScript integration with VS Code can actually help me catch errors that I might be making on my schema. So first off, I want to show you guys Apollo CodeGen. So I have a process, Apollo CodeGen, running here in the background. And what it's going to be doing is it's generating TypeScript types directly from my GraphQL query. So these are TypeScript definitions that are generated just by this CodeGen process, watching for GraphQL query changes. So if I add something here, like if I open my menu up again, whoops, and I add bio, and then I hit Command Save, you'll see bio just popped up here in my type defs. But I don't need bio, so I'll take that back out. It'll go away. But what I do want to do is I want to use these type defs to get safety on my query over there. So I'm going to import query result from @Apollo React common. And I'm going to import my Apollo types from the generated files. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to cast this response that I get from user query to those types, so I get the safety. And now, I don't know if you guys noticed, but I have red swigglies down here because I'm doing something unsafe. And if I hit Command Save, I'll actually get a compilation error from TypeScript saying, hey, you're doing something unsafe. And what I'm doing that's unsafe is I'm using this user property on the data object without checking that it's safe to do that, because user is actually a nullable property. It's a nullable field in my schema, so it's not safe to access things in this way. I need to actually add a nullability check. So if there's no data.user, we'll just return not found, wah wah. And if I save this, we've added our nullability check, it'll go away. So without TypeScript, I mean, I probably would have made this mistake as a coder. And if we had shipped that and we hadn't added this nullability check, then we would have had real users in production running into that error. So that is Apollo and your schema using TypeScript. The last thing I want to show you all is probably one of the most cool things about using Apollo on your client, because you can actually extend your GraphQL schema from your remote endpoint with more schema definitions on your client. And there are a lot of great use cases for this. One of them is that you can manage local state. So instead of needing to have just a few random fields in Redux because you want to store something across sessions in your browser's local storage, you can actually add that to your GraphQL schema and query it through Apollo. But in addition to that, my favorite use case for client-side fields is actually mocking. So I've been in scenarios many times as a developer where we decide we want to build a new component. We design the schema for that component. I've even done this with people in this room. And once you've defined your schema, you think you're good to go, but you need to actually go build your component now, and the schema doesn't exist. So how do I actually mock that data? There are a lot of great tools for mocking data on the server side. But because I can extend my schema on the client side as well, I'm actually fully in control of being able to mock my own endpoint. So to show you guys this, I want to add a field on the user type called isTrueKing. IsTrueKing obviously doesn't exist on our schema, so that's why VS Code is telling me it's red. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to hop over here to where I've got my Apollo client instance, and I'm going to define some client-side schema. So let's extend the type user with an isTrueKing field, and it will return a Boolean. Now that I have this, if I hit Command Save and I go back to user page, well, my squiggly is gone because now it does exist in my schema and it's valid. The only problem is I haven't written any function, so it's not going to know how to resolve. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to define a client-side resolver. And I'm going to make this on the user type. And we all know that every time a Targaryen is born, a coin is flipped. So there's going to be a 50% chance that any given user is the true king. And now that I have my client-side resolvers, I will simply add resolvers to my client. So now I can query for this field through my query, and I will get a result back. So I've already added isTrueKing to my query. If I get it off my data object and I put it onto my user, do you guys think I'm going to be the true king? Thank you. I am not the true king. I've also got a type gen error, but if I save it, it'll go away. All right, I'm not the true king, but I think I can keep reloading this page till I am the true king. All right, that's client-side state. So I kind of want to leave you guys with a thought. I'll go back to mirroring my screen. Uh-oh, I've lost my slides. Sorry, give me 1 minute. No. Technology, it's supposed to be easy, and sometimes it's still hard. All right, here we go. OK, well, actually, yeah. So all that code that we wrote, that was just a small part of the Redux app, but I actually mocked out, I built an entire clone of that Redux app using Apollo. I built the rest of the components. And it turns out that if you use GraphQL and if you use Apollo in that way, not only do you end up with 12 files instead of 16 in your source folder, but you end up with about 250 lines of code instead of 700. So it's about 35% of the size. And that's including the generated type defs, which is large because it's generated code. So I want to leave you all with this thought. Our data layer is only going to get smarter over time. And we're only going to be continuing to make certain aspects of this programming model easier. What I've just shown you is just scratching the surface. It's just the tip of the iceberg. Building features at your companies, it should be as simple as just writing queries, because that's how we think about it. And that's what we deserve as developers. So if you guys have any questions on this, you can come find me after. But next up, I'm actually super excited to introduce you to my colleague James, who's going to be showing you all GraphQL Federation, which is really, really cool. Thank you.